Americans keep gaining weight. 3/4 of us are overweight and half are obese. Most of us follow a diet to lose weight, yet we continue to gain weight. The top 5 diets are intermittent fasting, clean eating, ketogenic, low carb, gluten-free, and plant-based, and the list goes on. But the Dietary Guidelines for Americans is not even on the list of the top 20 diets, yet the guidelines are continually blamed for America's obesity epidemic. My name is Dustin Burnett, and I'm a research dietitian. I manage the Metabolic Kitchen and Human Feeding Laboratory at the United States Department of Agriculture's Western Human Nutrition Research Center on the campus of the University of California in Davis. Today I'm going to talk about the diet that nobody follows in my lecture entitled Much Ado About the Dietary Guidelines for Americans. Before I begin, I'd like to point out that what I'm presenting in these slides is information and data interpreted through my own professional lens as a research dietitian. I'll be covering quite a bit of territory, including some controversial topics related to the Dietary Guidelines for Americans. Although I'll be sharing with you some of the research we're doing at the USDA's Western Human Nutrition Research Center at UC California, Davis, I want to make it clear that nothing I say or present in these slides should be taken as a position of or endorsement by the United States Department of Agriculture, the Agricultural Research Service, the Western Human Nutrition Research Center, or the University of California. You'll find references and hyperlinks on each slide. I encourage you to visit them to learn more. Permission to reproduce these slides outside of the academic setting is kindly declined. And when you come across an error in either my words, data, or conclusions, I encourage you to bring it to my attention by emailing me at djburnett@ucdavis.edu. So where are we going today? We're going to cover quite a bit of ground. I'm going to introduce the Dietary Guidelines for Americans. I'll share with you some of the research that we're doing at the Western Human Nutrition Research Center. I'll introduce setting SMART goals. I'll introduce you to chronic diseases related to nutrition. I'll share with you how food production, dietary recommendations, and dietary intake have changed. We'll look at adherence to the dietary guidelines. I'll introduce you to some external influences on food choices, and I'll explain why you should care about the dietary guidelines. Now, I'm putting this slide first because it answers the so what question. And what do I mean by the so what question? Well, I can share with you all this really interesting information about how eating a healthful diet is good for you, but why should you care? Well, money talks. So here it is in the language of money. This study reports that for every $1 spent on workplace wellness programs, you'll see a return on investment of $3.27 in lower medical costs and $2.73 in less absenteeism, which totals $5. Of course, this is only one study, but it does attempt to assign a dollar amount to not only the amount you spend, but also the not so easy to calculate amounts that you will see by having healthier workers. And what components of these workplace wellness programs are related to diet? We have weight loss programs, health risk assessments, exercise programs and activities, and nutrition education. Workplace wellness pays off. Okay, so I've thrown calculations at you first thing in the lecture. Now let's balance it out so I don't lose some of you who might be thinking this lecture is going to be full of calculations. Think about this. A diet higher in plant-based foods such as vegetables, fruits, whole grains, legumes, nuts, and seeds, and lower in calories than animal-based foods is more health-promoting and is associated with less environmental impact than is the current U.S. diet. We've all heard this, right? Let's think about this for a bit. Healthful or not? Which is more healthful? Answer these questions about which of these two foods is more healthful. Let's start with cheese. We have natural cheddar cheese, and we have processed American cheese. Which one is more healthful? Hold on to that thought. We'll come back around to it later in the lecture. Now let's take a look at breakfast sausage. We have breakfast sausage made with pork and vegetarian breakfast sausage. Note the vegetarian sausage is plant-based. Which one is more healthful? Hold on to that thought. We'll come back around to it later in the lecture. Okay, we have one more. Burgers. Let's take a look at the burger component. We have a hamburger made with beef and a vegetarian Impossible Burger. Note that the Impossible Burger is plant-based. By now you should know both the question and answer I'm going to give. That's right. Hold on to that thought. We'll cover it again at the end of the lecture. Usually when I ask how many people in the room have heard of the Dietary Guidelines for Americans, about half the class raises their hands. So I'm going to give you a brief overview. The Dietary Guidelines for Americans, and from this point on I'll refer to them simply as the guidelines, they take the accumulation of science and translate the results into specific food-based guidance. Their purpose is to serve as a tool to help Americans improve their health and maintain optimal health. The emphasis now is on preventing chronic diseases. And one thing a lot of people don't realize is that they also help Americans enjoy a healthful diet. Now, when I'm speaking of chronic disease prevention, I'm talking about heart disease, high blood pressure, type 2 diabetes, some cancers, and poor bone health. The guidelines are mandated by federal law to be reviewed every 5 years by the United States Department of Agriculture and the Department of Health and Human Services. Their intended audiences are policymakers and nutrition and health professionals. One of the important aspects of the guidelines is that they're an evidence-based source of nutrition information. I'm going to readdress this in a bit. You can also see who uses the guidelines: the National School Lunch Program, School Breakfast Program, WIC, and others. Let's talk about the evidence-based source. Some of the evidence that's used to develop the guidelines comes from the surveillance and monitoring that's conducted by the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey, otherwise known as NHANES. The goal of NHANES includes assessing the health and nutritional status of Americans. It occurs every 2 years. It collects demographic, socioeconomic, dietary, and other health-related questions. It conducts medical, dental, and physiological measurements along with laboratory tests. It calculates the prevalence of major diseases and risk factors for disease. It determines the national standards for height, weight, and blood pressure. And it develops public health policy, directs and designs health programs and services, and expands knowledge for the nation. The development of the Dietary Guidelines for Americans. First, there's a scientific review of all the available scientific evidence about nutrition and health. This is done by the Dietary Guidelines Scientific Advisory Committee. It's made up of scientists from nutrition and medical professions. This committee publishes their report, and this report is reviewed by the United States Department of Agriculture and the Department of Health and Human Services. This is where the rubber meets the road, as the saying goes. I'll show you more in a bit. The United States Department of Agriculture and the Department of Health and Human Services then publish the guidelines, and nutrition and health professionals implement them. Now, here's something which you may not be aware. The public is encouraged to provide input through the process. The public can nominate people for the Scientific Advisory Committee. The public can comment during the entire process. Do a search for Dietary Guidelines public comments to find out how. Another thing I find from previous lectures is that not everyone comes from a scientific background, so I'm going to briefly go through the scientific process. Now, if only this process were used by more people in their everyday lives. First, you notice something. You have an observation. From this observation, ideally, you would form a testable hypothesis before jumping to any conclusions. From there, you would design an experiment that includes both a control group and an experimental group. The control group is the group you do nothing to. The experimental group is the group where you make changes. Once you've conducted your experiment, you review the results. And if the evidence supports your hypothesis, you repeat the experiment to verify you can get the same results. And once the evidence has been repeated and then reveals the same results, it becomes scientific theory. However, if your evidence does not support your hypothesis, then you rethink your hypothesis and try again. It's important to note that the scientific theory can also change. Now let's take a look at a real-life example of the scientific method. My colleagues and I observed that in 2014, there were no randomized controlled trials evaluating the effectiveness of the guidelines. In case you've not already learned about the different types of studies out there, a randomized controlled trial is an experimental study, and it's considered the gold standard for evaluating true cause and effect. Ideally, the randomized controlled trial will be what's called double-blinded, meaning that neither the investigator nor the participants know which treatment was prescribed. This helps to reduce the innate bias that exists in everyone, including researchers. That said, most nutrition studies are epidemiological, meaning populations are monitored over time. These are observational type studies that can only determine an association between two or more variables. They cannot determine true cause and effect. So when you're reviewing literature, reading the news, or listening to friends or colleagues over cocktails or dinner, remember to ask the question, was it a randomized controlled trial? Okay, let's get back to our example. After our observation, we then developed a hypothesis that we could improve health over a short-term period of 8 weeks just by changing diet. We'd already seen plenty of studies that show how weight loss, diet, and physical activity together show beneficial effects. But what if we only change diet? So we designed a controlled human feeding study that assigned participants to one of two diets. The control diet was a diet that represented the typical American diet. The other diet was based on the dietary guidelines. Our main measures of change in health were glucose homeostasis and fasting lipids. In other words, how well the participants' bodies controlled blood sugar and cholesterol. 44 women who were at risk for heart disease participated in the study. We provided them with all the foods and drinks they were expected to consume over the 8-week period. And what did we find? Without weight loss or changes in physical activity, it appears that diet alone cannot improve markers of heart disease. But this is only one study. Remember, in the scientific method, that experiments need to be repeated before they can become scientific theory. In our instance, the evidence did not support the hypothesis. So now we're in the process of designing another controlled feeding study. In this study, we're using the results from our previous study as an observation. And this time, we're going to repeat the model, but we're going to add a weight loss and physical activity component. With the typical American group, we're going to have two groups. One group with physical activity represented by PA in the slide and weight loss represented by WL in the slide. The other group will also have physical activity but without weight loss. In the experimental group, the dietary guidelines group, we're going to do the same physical activity with and without weight loss, but with a diet based on the guidelines. We're also going to increase our sample size to about 150 women. This study will take about 5 years to conduct, and with the current COVID-19 pandemic, it may take longer because we cannot recruit or enroll any study participants at the moment. So stay tuned. Now that we've gone over how the science works, let's look at how the guidelines are developed. Remember when I mentioned earlier about the guidelines helping Americans determine what they should be eating and that they are evidence-based? Well, the Scientific Advisory Report is evidence-based. But once the Dietary Guidelines Scientific Advisory Committee publishes their report, this is where things get political. The USDA and the DHHS are then faced with a complicated assignment. They review the evidence from the Advisory Committee as well as the comments from the various stakeholders in the guidelines. As you can imagine, people eat every day, and what people eat can affect a lot more than just one person. First of all, everyone needs to make a living. This means that everyone needs to generate income. Naturally, if you're a producer such as a farmer or a food manufacturer, you're going to want people to buy your crops or products. Similarly, if you're an environmentalist, you will likely want people to be eating a more sustainable diet by choosing foods that don't negatively impact the environment. And if you're a physician or dietitian, you'll be providing health and dietary recommendations to your patients, so you'll want them to be able to make healthful food choices more easily. Then you have the everyday Americans who have their own priorities when it comes to choosing foods. Basically, putting together one public policy document that satisfies all these interest groups is challenging, and rarely, if ever, does anyone feel fully satisfied with the result. Which brings me to one of the most important professional skills you can develop: compromising. Obviously, everybody wants things done their way. The problem with this way of thinking is that one person's ideals could be another person's nightmares. We live in one of the most culturally diverse countries in the world, and we all have different ideas of what healthful eating is. Remember, Science is just one component of the numerous influences on food choices. And toward the end of this lecture, I'm going to show you a model that helps you see the many external forces that are influencing your food choices. Anyway, you can show through an experiment that an eating pattern can improve health, but how will the results of those experiments be implemented? And how will the public respond? After all, if people don't adopt the change, then how can you get them to make and maintain the change in the long term? This takes us to stage 3, implementing the dietary guidelines. Once the guidelines have been published, it's then time to implement them. At this stage, it's a good idea to set goals, especially SMART goals. What does it mean to set SMART goals? Well, the goal needs to be specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and time-bound. In other words, you need to determine what needs to be accomplished and what actions will be taken to accomplish the goal. Next, what data will you collect to measure the accomplishment against a standard? Is the goal achievable? Does the goal align with what you are trying to achieve? And when will the goal be accomplished? It doesn't do much good to set a goal that cannot be achieved. Now that you know the components of setting SMART goals, let's see some examples. Are these goals SMART or not? Eat a variety of foods. Is it specific? No. Is it measurable? No. Is it achievable? Yes, just look at the variety of foods you can find everywhere around you. Is it realistic? Yes, food is everywhere. For example, many years ago you would go into a hardware store to buy hardware. Now you can go to a home improvement store and buy sodas, candies, and chips. Is it time-bound? No. Let's look at the second one. Avoid too much fat, saturated fat, and cholesterol. What's too much? Eat foods adequate in starch and fiber. What's adequate? What are the sources of starch? Bread, potatoes, corn, carrots? Avoid too much sugar. Avoid too much sodium. Again, what's too much? As it turns out, these were 5 of the 7 recommendations from the first set of the guidelines published in 1980. Let's look at 3 more. This is the food guide pyramid from 1990. Although it starts to be more measurable by providing a number of servings, it's not clear how much of serving size is. It also looks like one could eat anywhere from 6 to 11 servings of grains. How many servings is a plate of pasta? Some might count the entire plate as 1 serving, when it can actually be 5 servings. In terms of being realistic, why is this presented as a pyramid? What does the pyramid mean? Fats, oils, and sweets are at the top, but it says to eat them sparingly. This one is the 2005 Food Guide Pyramid. I see that it's now called My Pyramid, which makes it sound like it's personalized to me. I see someone walking up the stairs, so it looks like I'm supposed to be getting more physical activity. The colors are vibrant and I see lots of food. Fats and sweets are not mentioned anywhere. I don't see any means of measuring my intake. I still don't understand the pyramid, do you? Finally, let's look at this one. Now I see a plate. This makes sense to me because I eat off of plates. This makes it more realistic than a pyramid. I also see that half of my plate should be fruits and vegetables, with vegetables looking like they should make up more than fruits. And just under a quarter of my plate should be protein, and a little more than a quarter should be grains. The grains are colored brown, which makes me think of whole grains. It's telling me to choose my plate, which makes me feel like I'm in control. I don't understand the dairy option. Is it milk? It also includes the website where I can look up additional details. Altogether, this icon is closer to a SMART goal than any of the others. What do you think? Now that we've talked about setting SMART goals, let's see what recommendations or goals that are being set by the current set of guidelines. Before I go into this, it's important to note that we're still using the 2015 to 2020 guidelines because the 2020 to 25 guidelines have not yet been released. That said, the guidelines don't really change that much from cycle to cycle. I'll show you a table in a bit that shows this. So the guidelines state that a healthy eating pattern includes fruits, vegetables, proteins, dairies, grains, and oils. It also limits saturated fats and trans fats, sodium, and added sugars. Currently, the guidelines recommend eating less than 10% of your calories per day from added sugars, less than 10% from saturated fats, eating less than 2,300 milligrams of sodium per day, and if you drink alcohol, drink no more than 1 drink per day if you're a woman, and no more than 2 drinks per day if you're a man. As a side note, the 2020-2025 Dietary Guidelines Scientific Advisory Report recommends that the next publication of the guidelines encourage consuming less than 6% of calories from added sugars and no more than 1 drink of alcohol per both men and women. Stay tuned. We'll see what gets published next year after the USDA and DHHS publish the official recommendations. I'm going to show you a table in the next slide that lays out how many servings of each food group is recommended based on the number of calories you eat. But first, here's an overview summary. Keep in mind that this graph breaks down the percentage of calories that should be coming from the different food groups, not from nutrients. I'll explain more in a bit. Basically, the guidelines recommend that the percent of calories from the food you eat per day should be as follows: 10% from fruit, 13% from vegetables, 15% from protein foods, 11% from dairy, 26% from grains, 12% from oils, and less than 13% is solid fats and added sugars. Now remember, this is the percentage of calories from food groups, not nutrients. Let's take a look at the dairy group for a bit. The dairy group not only includes animal milk, but it also includes calcium and vitamin D fortified soy milk. But it does not include any of the other dairy milks like cashew milk, almond milk, hemp milk, etc. So why would it include calcium and vitamin D fortified soy milk, but not the other non-dairy milks? It's the protein content. Animal milk has about 8 grams of protein per cup. The amount of protein in soy milk is also about 8 grams per cup. On the other hand, almond milk has about 1 gram of protein per cup, hemp milk has about 2 grams of protein per cup, and cashew milk has less than 1 gram per cup. When you look at their nutrient composition as a whole, the animal and fortified soy milks are far more nutritious than the others. But don't take my word for it, go look it up yourself. Speaking of looking things up, you may have heard about the debate over using the term milk when dairy producers saying only dairy milk can be called milk, whereas the producers of nut milks argue that the dairy producers are using their power to keep them out of the market. Well, the Food and Drug Administration, or the FDA, defines milk as the lacteal secretion obtained by the complete milking of one or more healthy cows, which may be clarified and may be adjusted by separating part of the fat therefrom, concentrated milk, reconstituted milk, and dry whole milk. This definition exists so that manufacturers cannot put another product on the market and mask it as milk. This goes far beyond the dairy industry. Now, in case you're not familiar with the FDA, it's a federal government agency that is responsible for protecting public health by ensuring the safety, efficacy, and security of our nation's food supply. Now, I know there are some government skeptics out there, so I'm going to step away from the topic at hand just for a bit. For those skeptics out there, I fully encourage you to continue being skeptical because it keeps us, everyone, on their toes. I also encourage you to extend that same level of skepticism to the food industry, the medical profession, the pharmaceutical companies, news, conspiracy theorists, and yes, even your own farmers markets, local grocers, neighborhood stores, and again, even your own friends and family members. There are many opinions out there, but opinions are not facts. Personally, I chose to work for the government because I want my hard work to benefit society as a whole, not put profit in someone else's pockets. Is the government perfect? Heck no! I get so frustrated at times working in the government. But it's more in line with my principles, so I continue moving forward. And it's really important that you learn about and become involved with your government, because we all live in a country where we can become a part of the system that can make the change we want to see. The generations that came before us, as imperfect as they were, fought many battles to get us where we are today. Every generation, including yours, has a battle to fight. Now, where were we? Oh yes, the FDA's definition of milk. So why would the FDA even have a definition for milk in the first place? Let's go back in time for a bit. Picture it, America, 1906. A book called The Jungle by Upton Sinclair is published that documents the appalling working conditions of the meatpacking industry. He describes how meat being prepared for Americans was diseased, rotten, and contaminated. I remember reading this book when I was in college, especially the part where one of the workers fell into the meat grinding machine and became part of someone's next meal. Disgusting, I know. But even more disgusting was that the company told the worker's family that he took his paycheck and fled instead of telling them what really happened. The FDA was established in 1906, partly in response to this book. In other instances, food manufacturers adulterate foods so they could make more profit. This means they put something else in the product instead of what they say is in it. For example, without a definition for ice cream that includes the percent fat and the weight of a gallon of ice cream, manufacturing companies could add water to replace the cream and air to increase the volume while still charging you for the more expensive ingredients you're not getting. It's a similar situation with butter. Without a definition that states what the fat and water content of butter must be, manufacturers could cut the butter with water to extend it. The definition of milk has been around for decades. Now we have these nut-based beverages on the market. Should they be called milk? Or should they be called something else? What do you think? And whatever you do think, call your congressperson and tell them what you think. It's their job to listen to you. Here in the USDA food patterns, you see along the top the various calorie levels. On the left-hand side, you see the different food groups. Let's look at the 2,000 calorie column as an example. You see here that the guidelines recommend 2 cups of fruits, 2.5 cups of vegetables, 6 ounces of grains, 5.5 ounces of protein foods, 3 cups of dairy, 27 grams of oil, and no more than 258 calories from solid fats and added sugars. I've also added sodium and potassium to the table, as well as the ratio of sodium to potassium. Why? Well, there's still quite a bit of controversy over sodium because only about 30% of the population is salt sensitive, meaning that their blood pressure is affected by the intake of sodium. There's still debate over what is more important, whether it's the absolute amount of sodium or if it's the balance between the sodium and potassium. For instance, in Japan, the average sodium intake is about 5,000 milligrams per day. In America, the average intake is about 3,400 milligrams per day. In Japan, about 8% of deaths are caused by cardiovascular disease or heart disease, whereas in the US, about 25% of deaths are caused by cardiovascular disease. That's a threefold difference. However, the average daily intake of vegetables in Japan is about 280 grams, whereas in the US, daily intake is about 50 grams at best. That's more than 5 times the amount of vegetables that are eaten in Japan. And vegetables are generally a rich source of potassium. So if you have a higher sodium and a higher potassium diet, then perhaps sodium isn't as detrimental. It's certainly worth investigating. Speaking of heart disease, I'm showing you this slide so you can see how the leading causes of death have changed over the past 100 plus years. As you can see in 1900, the leading causes of death were from infectious disease, the first being pneumonia, the second tuberculosis, and the third from diarrhea and what you can't see is gastrointestinal infections. Nutrition came into play in the sense that those who were malnourished were at a higher risk of dying from infectious disease. Over the course of the 20th century, the emphasis on nutrition was to prevent malnutrition by providing adequate calories for Americans. As the century closed, you can see in 1997 that the leading causes of death were no longer from infectious diseases, but from the development of chronic disease such as heart disease, cancer, and stroke. You also see that diabetes is now on the chart. In 2017, you can see that heart disease and cancer are still the leading causes of death, but you see a decline in heart disease and cancer when compared to 1997. This decline is most likely due to significant reductions in cigarette smoking, as well as improvements in medication to manage blood pressure and cholesterol, while also having more advanced placement of thrombolysis and stents. Thrombolysis is a treatment that dissolves blood clots. Stents are devices that are inserted into the blood vessel and then expanded to open up the blood vessel. In other words, people are now living longer and have more food. This led to a decrease in malnutrition and an increase in overweight and obesity. Now I will provide an additional word of caution here. It used to be the assumption that people who were overweight or obese were overnourished. But we now see that people can be overweight and obese and be undernourished, meaning that most of their calories are coming from foods that do not have adequate vitamins and minerals to prevent nutrient deficiencies. Now, if you look at these yellow boxes, you can see that overweight and obesity rates in 1900 are not around because overweight and obesity were not considered a problem at that time. That is, the problem was people not getting enough food. However, in 1997, the prevalence of overweight in the U.S. was greater than 50% of American adults, and 20% of American adults were obese. And when we look at 2017, nearly 3/4 of Americans are overweight, and almost half are obese. What do I mean by prevalence? Prevalence, not to be confused with incidence, is the proportion of the population at a given point in time that has a condition. Incidence, on the other hand, is the change in the proportion of the population from one point to another. One trick to remember the difference is to think P equals picture equals prevalence. You can then visualize prevalence as a snapshot in time. So how did this happen? Stay with me through the lecture and I'll show you towards the end. But first I'll show you a big picture of 100 years in about a minute. This graph shows how agricultural production changed during the 20th century. Along the horizontal axis, going left and right along the bottom, is the year. Along the vertical y-axis, going up and down along the left, is the agricultural exports index. Note there are no units because it's an index comparing production to the amount in 1987. That is, it's a ratio. As you can see, right around the time of the Great Depression during the 1930s, there was a decline in production. As the U.S. entered World War II in the 40s, production increased, and then after World War II, production continued to increase. So why am I showing you this graph? You may have already heard statements while having conversations with friends, classmates, or professors, or by reading in the news that the dietary guidelines made Americans fat. Now, before I continue, I want to point out that I'm simply providing another piece of the conversation. I'm not saying the guidelines made Americans fat, and I'm not saying they didn't. Why do I say this? Well, there are myriad variables to consider when trying to figure out the true causes. Note that I said causes and not cause. There are many contributing factors to the obesity epidemic that are beyond the scope of this lecture. However, what I do see when I read articles like this one in the Washington Post, or even when I read scientific journal articles, is that they often start the trajectory around 1970, which is toward the end of the Green Revolution. I'm not sure how many of you have heard of the Green Revolution. For the sake of this lecture, let's just say that the Green Revolution occurred roughly during the 20 years between 1950 and 1970. During this time, technologies drastically changed that increased agricultural production, not just in America but around the world. But if you look, the upward trajectory started around 1940 when the emphasis was on reducing malnutrition by increasing calories. Then the Green Revolution came along, and then between 1970 and 1980 we see another boost in production. During this decade, food became increasingly inexpensive. Americans were definitely getting enough calories and were starting to gain more weight. At the same time, they were still experiencing nutrient deficiencies. I'm going to sideline here for a second to mention that when I say Americans in these slides, I'm talking about the average American. At the same time this was happening, many Americans were not getting enough food. In 1968, a documentary was released that revealed extreme poverty and malnutrition in the San Antonio, Texas area. It's called Hunger in America, and it shocked America at the time. Okay, back to the graph. The first set of what we call the dietary guidelines for Americans were published in 1980. After a period of time where the emphasis was on calories, the emphasis of the new guidelines was to ensure Americans were getting enough vitamins and minerals from eating a variety of foods to prevent nutrient deficiencies. Although overweight and obese Americans existed, it was not so much a public health concern at this point, but nutrition deficiencies were. And in 1988, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention started reporting obesity data. To sum it all up so far, Americans were malnourished and dying from infectious diseases. The goal was to increase calories. Significant changes to the agricultural system increased the food supply, and Americans were getting enough calories, but they were still experiencing nutrient deficiencies. The guidelines were created in part to help reduce nutrient deficiencies by eating a variety of foods. At the same time, Americans were gaining weight. Now that we've covered food production during the 20th century, let's take a look at energy intake, that is, the amount of calories Americans were eating. In this graph, we have two estimators of energy intake. One is from a food called a 24-hour recall, and the other is from the availability data after adjustment for spoilage and other waste. Let's start with the 24-hour recalls, or the blue line. If you have not yet heard of 24-hour recall, it's a tool that's used to assess the dietary intake of someone during the past 24 hours. Respondents are asked to describe everything they ate and drank over the past 24 hours. Now, if I asked you to remember everything you ate or drank over the past 24 hours, would you be able to? And what if I asked you to describe the amounts as well? Would you know the recipes by memory? As you might imagine, 24-hour recalls are not an ideal tool because it relies on people's memory. It relies on a person being honest as well as being able to describe portion sizes accurately and recall recipes. Consequently, 24-hour recalls typically underestimate actual intake, especially in overweight and obese respondents. In this graph, the 24-hour recalls, represented by the blue line, suggest that Americans were eating about 1,900 calories in 1980. Then from 1980 to 1990, there was a dramatic increase. Then it leveled off a bit through about 2017. Now let's look at another way to estimate intake. This orange line represents food availability data that has been adjusted for spoilage and other waste. As you can see, it's a similar transition of about 1980, but then it continues increasing up until 2000 instead of leveling off at about 1990. Here's where the first set of guidelines were published in 1980. And here's where a fat-free boom started in 1990. I'll go into more detail on this one in a bit, but it's basically when people started cutting back on fat and replacing the calories with carbohydrates, particularly refined grains and added sugars. Regardless, we see from both graphs anywhere between an 11% to 23% increase in energy intake between 1970 and 2010, with a dramatic uptick beginning in 1980. Now let's take a look at where these calories were coming from. This graph takes the energy from the previous graph and shows where those calories were coming from. This blue line shows us what percentage of the diet was coming from carbohydrates. The red dotted trend line represents the moving average to give us an idea of where it's heading. The data I have for this slide start in 1980, when the first set of guidelines came out. You can see from about 1980 to 1990, roughly 45% of the calories were coming from carbohydrates. Then in 1990, we hit that fat-free boom that I mentioned in the previous slide. During this time, one of the goals was to cut back on total fat, saturated fat, and cholesterol while increasing vegetables, fruits, and grains, especially whole grains. However, the message that was heard by the public was fats are bad, carbs are good. In other words, the goal wasn't so smart. This led to people avoiding all fats, including heart-healthy fats and saturated fats. People avoided avocados, salad dressings made from oils, and nuts, and were replacing them with low-fat and non-fat food products that had removed the fat but replaced it with sugar. If you recall, the guidelines recommended against eating too much sugar. So why would fat be replaced with sugars in foods? It turns out that when you reduce fat, you need something to replace it to maintain the sensory characteristics that are pleasing. That is, by increasing sugar, you can mimic the mouthfeel that the higher fat foods had. And since sugar is only 4 calories per gram and fat is 9 calories per gram, replacing the fats with sugar seemed the logical choice. Consequently, you can see how the carbohydrate intake increased starting in the 1990s. But it was mostly refined carbohydrates like sugars along with refined grain products instead of the vegetables, fruits, and whole grains. Now let's look at protein as represented by the solid red line. We don't see a dramatic change in protein, but you can see it did decrease. However, it pretty much stayed around 17 to 20% of daily calories. The dotted yellow trend line represents the moving average. And here we have fat, represented by the solid green line, with the dotted red trend line being the moving average. Again, you can see a dramatic reduction in fat intake starting in the 1990s, and then it pretty much stays at about 34% of daily calories through 2015. So between carbohydrates and fat, you can see this significant divergence beginning in 1990 with carbohydrate intake increasing and fat decreasing. You can also see how well the population has continued to hold on to this pattern of low fat is better. As you might imagine, we continue to see an increase in weight because of eating too many calories. In this graph, I'm going to show how weight continued to increase in the United States from 1960 to 2017. Along the horizontal axis are the years. Along the vertical axis is the percent of the population. The green line represents obesity. The blue line is extreme obesity. As you can see, the percentage of Americans that are obese has been increasing steadily. The percentage of Americans that are extremely obese has continued to increase as well. After the introduction of the dietary guidelines in 1980, you see a dramatic increase in obesity over the next 20 years. Is this cause and effect, or is it coincidence? And here's the fat-free boom marker again for reference. For the sake of argument, let's say that the guidelines did cause an increase in obesity. Remember, one of the main goals of the dietary guidelines was to what? Increase the intake of vitamins and minerals by increasing a variety of foods. What do you think might be the cause of this increase in weight? Hold on to that thought, if you have one. Now that I've shared with you data on adults, let's take a look at children in reference to adults. This blue bar represents the percentage of Americans that were obese in 1970. As you can see, about 5% on average of children were obese and 15% of adults were obese. Jump to 2008 as represented by this orange bar, you can see a dramatic increase across the board. In children 2 to 5 years, obesity doubled. In children 6 to 11 years, obesity increased 5-fold. In children 12 to 19, obesity tripled, and in adults, obesity doubled. And in 2016, as represented by this green bar, you can see again that obesity increased, except for children 6 to 11 years old. But none of these increases or decreases were as dramatic as the increases from 1970 to 2008. We also start to see changes in the population's health. In this graph, you can see how in 1960, about 1% of the population had diabetes. And then when we get to 1990, we start seeing a dramatic increase in the slope that has not yet subsided. From 1980 to 2005, represented by the yellow shading, the guidelines primarily targeted a so-called healthy population. But in 2005, the guidelines started emphasizing eating patterns to reduce the risk of developing major chronic diseases like diabetes. Diabetes is a complex topic, best reserved for another lecture. But diabetes, especially type 2 diabetes, is caused by factors that include lifestyle choices, such as being overweight or obese, or not being physically active. Diabetes can also lead to heart disease, as well as kidney disease, nerve damage, eye damage, and other conditions. Now that we've seen how food production, energy intake, obesity rates, and chronic diseases like diabetes have increased over the years, let's take a look at how the guidelines have changed. Before we start going through this table, I'd like to point out that the reference calories is 2,000 calories, just like when we went through the USDA food patterns. Okay, starting at the top left, we see in 1980 and 1985, emphasis was on eating a variety of foods while avoiding too much fat, saturated fat, cholesterol, sodium, and sugars. Do you remember when I showed you the USDA food patterns table earlier? Notice how in 1980 and 1985 versions here, there is no mention of serving sizes for each group. Let me talk a little bit about fats to be sure everyone's on the same page. Saturated fat is solid at room temperature, whereas mono and polyunsaturated fats are liquid at room temperature. Saturated fats come primarily from animal sources, but also from tropical oils such as coconut and palm oils. Polyunsaturated fats include liquid oils such as corn oil, soybean oil, and peanut oil, to name a few. Oils that are high in monounsaturated fats are olive oils and canola oils, for example. Okay, let's move on to 1990, 1995, and the 2000 versions. We see recommendations for the number of servings to eat, but notice that the serving sizes are not defined. It's not clear how much of the food equals a serving, and we don't know who gets to eat the plus servings. Basically, a plate with 4 cups of pasta could be interpreted as 1 serving, when actually 4 cups of pasta is 8 servings. Note, 1 serving is 1 ounce of dried pasta. In other words, a typical fettuccine alfredo from a chain restaurant that provides about 1,300 calories also provides 5 servings of pasta. Do you see how easy it is to overeat? We have practically an entire day's worth of grains in one plate. We also see a change in language. It no longer says to avoid certain foods. Instead, it says to choose foods. We also start to see more emphasis on saturated fats. Then we see recommendations for not eating too much cholesterol, sodium, or sugar. Starting in 2005, we start to see actual amounts of foods. That is, 2 cups of fruit or 6 ounces of meat. We also see that we should be consuming less than 10% of our daily calories from saturated fats and eating less than 300 milligrams of cholesterol. But we still don't have a serving defined for sugars. Then in 2010, we see recommendations not just to reduce saturated fat, but to also replace saturated fats with mono and polyunsaturated fats. We also see a further reduction in sodium for people at increased risk. In 2015, we see that teen boys and men are eating too much meat, poultry, and eggs, and we finally have a serving defined for added sugars. That is, less than 10% of your daily calories should be coming from added sugars. In other words, the goals are gradually getting smarter. What you don't see on here are recommendations for the 2020 guidelines because they have not yet been published. But I mentioned earlier that the Scientific Advisory Report recommends cutting added sugars down to less than 6% of daily intake as opposed to 10%. Clearly, Americans have been eating way too much added sugar. We just went through the changes to the dietary guidelines over the years. Now let's take a look at the costs of foods. This graph shows the percent change in the cost of foods from 1985 to 2014. During this time, the cost of non-alcoholic beverages, for example, sugar-sweetened drinks like soda, sweet tea, and energy drinks, decreased by about 26%. Similarly, the cost of sugar and sweets, that is, added sugars, decreased by about 12%, and the cost of fats and oils decreased by about 4%. In other words, sweetened drinks, sugars and sweets, fats and oils all became less expensive. At the same time, the cost of fresh fruits and vegetables increased by about 40%. That is, fruits and vegetables got more expensive. Basically, we have the guidelines telling Americans to eat more fresh fruits and vegetables and cut back on the solid fats and added sugars. At the same time, the cost of fruits and vegetables was increasing and the cost of sugary drinks and foods and fats were getting less expensive. When you're feeding a family and don't have a lot of money, what are you going to eat? Earlier in the lecture, I introduced the Washington Post article that questioned if the guidelines were making Americans fat. Then I showed you how the goal was to cut back on total fat, saturated fat, and cholesterol while increasing vegetables, fruits, and grains, especially whole grains. And remember, the message heard by the public was fats are bad, carbs are good. In this study published in 2010, the investigators discovered that for the period from 2001 to 2004, less than 10% of Americans were meeting the dietary recommendations. In other words, the majority of Americans were not following the guidelines. Well, on the flip side, could it also be that the majority of Americans misunderstood the goals of the guidelines? In terms of food groups, Americans were eating more grains and proteins than fruits, vegetables, dairy, and oils, but they were nowhere near meeting the recommendations. Note, meeting the recommendations would mean that the bar reaches all the way over to the vertical line at 100. At the same time, the percent of the population exceeding the recommendations for solid fats and added sugars was about 80 to 90% of the population. So why aren't people meeting the recommendations? Were they simply not following them, or were they not understanding them? One thing I will point out is that although the USDA food patterns point out servings of the various food groups, most people eat foods that are a combination of food groups. For example, spaghetti with meat sauce has grains from the pasta, vegetables from the tomatoes, onions, garlic, and basil, protein from the meat, and oil. But when you're presented with a plate of spaghetti with meat sauce, how do you know how to break it apart into the food groupings? It's not easy to do, even for me. Every year, the International Food Information Council conducts a national survey of American consumers to ask the perceptions, beliefs, and behaviors around food and food purchasing decisions. In the latest publication, they discovered that consumers' familiarity with the dietary guidelines has nearly doubled from 2010 to 2020. Although the true reasons for this occurrence are beyond the scope of this lecture, it's interesting to point out that the public messaging of the dietary guidelines underwent a significant overhaul in 2011. My Plate was introduced by First Lady Michelle Obama. We saw in the earlier slide that more Americans are familiar with the guidelines now than in the past. But how are they adhering to the recommendations? I'm introducing what's called the Healthy Eating Index on this slide. This is a scoring tool that takes foods reported through 24-hour recalls and calculates an overall diet score to see how closely their reported intake aligns with the guidelines. A score of 100 indicates that the quality of the diet meets or exceeds the recommendations. As you can see in this graph, the Healthy Eating Index score of the American population as a whole has gradually increased from a score of 49 in 2000 to a score of 59 in 2012. But the population is still not meeting the recommendations. And why is it important that Americans follow the dietary guidelines? According to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, 60% of Americans have a chronic disease, and 40% of Americans have two chronic diseases. The annual health care cost to the taxpayers, that's you and me, is $3.5 trillion. That's 19% of gross domestic product, or GDP. GDP is the total amount of goods and services provided by Americans in a given year. That's 1/5 of America's GDP being spent on healthcare costs related to chronic diseases. As I mentioned earlier, the most common chronic disease is heart disease. However, the most costly is diabetes. And the greatest risk factor for chronic diseases, guess what? Obesity. The Journal of the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics published an article that calculated the cost savings from nutrition-related chronic diseases such as heart disease, cancer, and diabetes. If we could get the HEI score of Americans from 59 to 72, the country could see a savings of $32 billion. And if we could get the HEI score of Americans from 59 to 80, the country could see a savings of $55 billion. Workplace wellness pays off. But there are many challenges ahead. In this slide, I'm going to show you some of the various external influencers on food choices. We start at the individual level. Here is where our own personal biology and other factors that are close to home influence our choices. Examples include what we consider our personal norms, our level of education, income, taste preferences, and so forth. At the next level are the sociocultural influences. These include things like our traditional culture and customs that we learn from a very young age. Then we have our community environment. These are places like work, school, and access to grocery stores and restaurants. Then we have the agricultural, industrial, and marketing influences such as farming practices, availability of food, industry lobbying, marketing, and other forms of media. Then we have the governmental influences. This is where the dietary guidelines fit in. And finally, we have the global influences. This includes things like climate, geography, international trade, multinational industry lobbying, etc. All of these factors are working in tandem to influence the food choices you eat. Is it any wonder why Americans are having difficult time meeting the dietary guidelines? Let's get back to our healthful or not slides. Let's start with cheese. We have the all-natural cheddar cheese, and we have the processed American cheese. Which one's more healthful? The cheddar cheese has 5 ingredients, whereas the American cheese has twice as many. The cheddar cheese has ingredients to which we can better relate. The American cheese has added stabilizers and coagulators in the form of chemical names. So which one is more healthful? Of course, I'm not going to give you the answer because that's a decision you have to make. Why would I say that? Well, eating a piece of either of these cheeses is safe. That is, you won't get sick from eating a piece, you won't develop heart disease from eating a piece, and you won't die from eating a piece, assuming proper food safety guidelines were followed. It's the overall dietary pattern over the course of your lifetime that may influence these consequences. That said, when I give this presentation in live format, most people say the American cheese is less healthful because it is more processed. I will say this, if you are someone trying to increase calcium in your diet, you are more likely going to get twice as much calcium from American cheese than you would cheddar. Plus, you can get 10 times as much vitamin D with American cheese. American cheese also has 25% fewer calories and about 30% fewer grams of saturated fat. Plus, American cheese melts better. Now let's take a look at breakfast sausage. We have breakfast sausage made with pork, and we have vegetarian breakfast sausage. Note the vegetarian sausage is plant-based, which is what the dietary guidelines encourages. So which one is more healthful? Here are the ingredients of the pork sausage, and here are the ingredients of the vegetarian sausage. Clearly the vegetarian sausage has far more ingredients than the pork sausage, but it's plant-based. Again, this is an answer you need to figure out for yourself. If you look at each ingredient and understand what each ingredient is and why each ingredient is there, you might feel more comfortable making a decision. Open up a web browser and search for FDA Overview of Food Ingredients, Additives, and Colors. Open the page and scroll down to the end. You will see a table that lists the type of additives, what the additives do, examples of foods in which they are used, and the names you will find on product labels. Okay, we have one more, burgers. We have a hamburger made with beef and a vegetarian Impossible Burger. Remember, the vegetarian Impossible Burger is plant-based. By now you should know both the question and answer I'm going to give. We're just looking at the patty here. The regular burger is 100% beef. The Impossible Burger is all of this. Again, I encourage you to look up the ingredients and learn about them before making your decision. Current research on the influence of processed foods on health is ongoing. This is another controversial area where many stakeholders disagree on the definitions of processed foods. But one classification system comes up quite a bit. In this article, foods are classified into one of four groups: unprocessed or minimally processed, processed culinary ingredients, processed foods, and ultra-processed foods. I encourage you to read up on this, and please stay tuned for additional research in this area. Thank you for your attention. Now, your feedback helps future students, so please take a minute or two to rate this lecture with the thumbs up or thumbs down icons below. Now, although rating does give me a general sense of feedback, it's much more useful to everyone if you leave professional and respectful comments, suggestions, and/or questions. Personally, I take feedback seriously, so please let me know your thoughts.